All right, welcome to chapter 26. I'm going to try to put this chapter all into one video. The chapter reading is pretty good. I tried to make the homework a little bit shorter this week, just kind of stick to the facts kind of questions. But I will warn you, this chapter tends to be somewhat technical. And because it also, kind of like the metabolic system, contains a lot of chemistry, um, I just don't want you to overthink it. You have already seen a lot of the information in this chapter, you just haven't looked at it in quite this way. So, start with the chapter. And we'll kind of work our way through some of the terminology, and the lab is a little bit different this week. It is primarily looking at electrolyte acid base disorders and being able to recognize those from basically laboratory data. So it's kind of a different perspective, but I just want to tell you that I don't think there's a more important topic in medicine. Being able to regulate not just your fluid balance, but your various electrolytes that, if they're high or low, can have really bad consequences, or acid base levels. It's probably just as important as blood pressure, to be honest. So let's kind of start with some basics. Let's kind of just look at what is the fluid that we're talking about here. We're going to see that the fluid is the cytosol, like the watery cytoplasm stuff, the dissolved solutes that are in there, and that includes everything from, protein to cells to sodium. We do see that there are distinctive compartments of fluid, and generally there's two isolated compartments. There's the interstitial fluid, or the extracellular fluid, and then there's the intracellular environment. Now, the intracellular environment is very contained with a membrane. But the extracellular fluid, we will see, can have some exchange between that fluid and the fluid inside the blood plasma. But I kind of think of the blood plasma as not really a compartment. I think of that as just blood, and then it circulates, and it's really just exchanging through the capillaries. So we'll start with the intracellular and extracellular environments and kind of the exchange between those two compartments. And then, of course, the blood plasma is going to kind of reinvigorate that interstitial or extracellular fluid. Now, we do need to regulate this stuff in terms of volume, where that volume is distributed between the compartments, and of course the concentration of solutes and pH. Remember that a lot of solutes are controlled through moving through channels or some kind of regulatory pathway. Water is going to generally be obligated to follow those solutes or salts. And pH is really just specifically hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions that are also solutes, but those kind of, we will negotiate that regulation separately because pH has such a terrible adverse impact when it's not within its range of homeostasis. So I love this picture because it has eyeballs on the brain. I also think it kind of looks somewhat childlike. Anyway, it's just kind of a distribution of the different body fluids, like how much fluid is found in different organs and tissues. As you might suspect, it can really vary, but depending on the lean versus the adipose mass of certain organs, you're going to see it all over the map. All right, the picture on the right is just kind of demonstrating those three fluid areas. The intracellular compartment, definitely enclosed by a membrane, highly regulated there. The interstitial fluid, or the extracellular fluid, is just kind of the soup that all those cells are sitting in. And then remember, the blood plasma is just the liquid portion of blood. And of course, through capillaries, we'll see that exchange into the interstitial environment will be possible. So I just kind of wrote those down for you so you can kind of remember there's really only two places where things change compartments. They'll exchange places across the cell membrane or across that very thin capillary. In terms of body water gain and loss, we want to kind of appreciate the variability in the range of the human body, especially as an adult. This does change with age, level of conditioning, Hormones can certainly play a role in how much muscle mass there is relative to adipose. Adipose by itself is pretty devoid of water. I mean, there's a little bit of water in there, but compared to something like muscle, that's really what kind of swings this range so far from one side to the other. How you gain water is from obviously drinking and eating. You get a little bit of metabolic water from the electron transport chain as oxygen is reduced at the last step from oxygen gas into H2O. But I will tell you that if you're dehydrated, you can't just make more water from metabolism. Like, that's not how it works. Like, you just produce enough ATP to service your cells. This is a very independent process. So this amount of water is pretty fixed. You will vary widely how much you are drinking and eating. And surprisingly, a lot of your water actually comes from food. So you should kind of take that into consideration from, like your overall water gain amount. I would say roughly it's about 2,500 mils per day. That's a pretty gross average. And I will also tell you that there's a little bit of debate in the physiology world about how much water intake, pure water intake, a person needs to sustain. And I will just say, like, whatever works for you. Like, there's no rule that you have to drink 8 ounce glasses of water a day or something like that. You form your own normal. We do, however, want to make sure that our loss is equal to our gain so that we stay within a nice equal fluid balance, which means that all the water intake and the water production from metabolic water needs to be equal to the amount that we're excreting through the urinary system. Sweat is one that's really super variable depending on your activity, depending on if you're just a pronounced sweater or not. That can actually be a pretty big area of water loss. Respiration is pretty fixed. It can depend on the humidity and the temperature of the air. So that's another one that can kind of, move around a little bit. But overall, we just want to make sure that our water in is equal to our water lost. And I kind of have a general idea here of what you're looking at. A couple hundred mils from metabolic water. I mean, that's not nothing, right? Like, it's good to keep track of that. Depending on your diet, you might have more soft, wet foods or less, just sort of depends. But the majority of your water intake is going to be from just drinking liquid. Water loss is going to come primarily from the kidneys, of course. Sweating, like I said, can really vary. This is kind of an average, almost kind of minimum, actually. 300 mils from the lungs is also an average. It can totally vary depending on the cold, dry air temperature. And the 100 mils from the GI tract is pretty much a fixed water loss from just the water content of the feces and the mucus that you need to lubricate that solid excretion. How do we regulate water gain? Like I said, we don't regulate metabolic water. If you need ATP, if the cells require more ATP to energize different reactions, that's going to stimulate aerobic cellular respiration, basically. So that's kind of like, you can't really move that up or down. You will, however, of course, get thirsty, and I don't want you to overthink this. When you need water, you will be stimulated to basically feel thirsty, and that thirst is going to intensify until basically you've satisfied your water needs. So, we will be talking about the hypothalamus as the main driver here. We've seen this before with the brain and other autonomic functions. But the hypothalamus actually gets a lot of information input from all over the body. Like, if you just think about how you feel when you're thirsty, like you don't have as much saliva, you might have kind of low blood volume and low blood pressure. Sometimes people can just feel really lethargic when that happens. There's going to be hormones that are trying to, recover as much water from the urine as possible, or maybe even vasoconstrict unnecessary blood flow to certain peripheral tissues. I mean, there's not just one signal to the hypothalamus that you're thirsty. It's going to kind of monitor conditions all over the human body so that you get a very loud, like, input to drink water. And when you drink, your levels should return to normal. Now, leave it to a physiologist to over complexify this pathway, but I think this is a beautiful flowchart in your book. So first, if you don't have enough water you're dehydrated, right? And you'll see two kind of very quick things happen. Your blood volume will go down and your blood osmolarity, remember osmolarity is like the salt concentration. If you have less water but the same amount of salts, it's saltier, right? So your blood is not only lower in volume, it is more concentrated and salty or higher in osmolarity. Now you can see that both of those follow different paths. The decreased blood volume is going to cause a decrease in blood pressure, and then we're going to see the RAA pathway snap on, and it's particularly angiotensin 2, which is both a vasoconstrictor and a stimulus hormone to the hypothalamus to be like, hey, I'm thirsty. I need more blood volume. Drink some fluid, right? And then you drink and then you're fine. But let's kind of follow the other path. The osmolarity has osmoreceptors, which are actually just looking for the salt concentration in blood. That's going to trigger an alert in the hypothalamus too. And the high blood osmolarity kind of sucks some of the moisture out of your saliva. So that dry mouth kind of is another like physical stimulus to the hypothalamus that you need to drink water. But overall, you know how this feels. You get dehydrated, you're thirsty. You should just know that your hypothalamus is getting information from multiple places for having, an important stimulus. And then it obviously is going to tell you to drink something and then go back to normal. How do we regulate water and solute loss is really happening in the kidneys, and it's good that we just covered this system. So this is going to seem a little repetitive even, but that's okay. Your kidneys are what you can use to lose water or different salts or chemicals through the urine filtrate. And I always kind of like to demonstrate like how this works with an example of eating something very salty. Like let's say you eat like a salty bag of chips, and as you eat salty food, you usually want something liquid to go with it. You'll feel kind of thirsty from it basically. And as you absorb that salt bomb and that water with it, usually what happens is you feel kind of like excessive fluid and salt, like maybe even a little bloated would be a word that I would use to describe it. And this is going to basically kick on your excretion mechanisms, right? You're going to unload some of that fluid, some of that salt, depending on, how much. And that should kind of bring you back down to normal. But it's something we do all the time. Like you can eat something really salty and then you feel kind of water retention and salt retention. And then you're kind of like, ooh, I gotta like let some of this go. And then you're like thirsty a little bit later as your blood volume has decreased. Anyway, it's just kind of like this perfect circle. I always kind of like to start with salty meal, increased fluid volume, and then specifically what's going to happen is we'll shut off the RAA pathway. Remember, the RAA pathway is to protect from low blood pressure and low blood volume. So when you've like acquired a lot of fluid and you're feeling kind of bloated, you want to shut that off, and your higher than normal blood volume should cause stretch in the heart, which releases the atrial natriuretic peptide. So with the decrease in angiotensin, with all of that RAA pathway stuff, we should see basically less vasoconstriction of the afferent arteriole into the renal corpuscle so that we can basically increase the glomerular filtration rate. Like that should basically produce more urine filtrate that has more water and salt moving through it at a quicker pace so that you're letting it go, right? You're actually going to release more water and salt just to decrease your blood volume a little bit. And that's not necessarily a good thing. You might actually kind of, lose more salts than you want, but, it's an emergency when your heart is stretched. We want to basically like let that stuff go. Overall, though, that should bring our fluid volume down. Once it's down too much, we'll see the ADH hormone kick in to regulate water loss so that we can basically recover more water from the urine filtrate. There's, a lot of things about ADH that is cool. But this is basically going to rescue water from the urine filtrate so that you can produce less urine, saltier urine for sure, because we're just going to try to recover as much water as possible, but put that water that we've recovered back into the blood so that our blood volume and our blood pressure can come back up. So I will say there are some things that are abnormal that can really also stimulate ADH secretion. And that's like vomiting, diarrhea, heavy sweating, fever, and burns. So those are things that, are not just dehydration. Those are things that can accelerate dehydration to the point that your homeostasis can be disrupted forever. And, vomiting, you're you're losing a lot of the fluids that we would normally get recovered from reabsorption in the small intestine. With diarrhea, you're losing too much water and sometimes other things like bicarbonate and stuff too that we want to keep. Heavy sweating, and most people don't sweat that heavily, but professional athletes do. Like, I actually really like to watch basketball because it's kind of I don't know. I don't get emotionally attached. I just like to watch it sometimes. And then, like, I kind of went to college in the days where Michael Jordan was playing basketball, and oh my gosh, you just watch these guys like sweat like so much, and that's what I mean by heavy sweating. Like, if you're just going for a walk or whatever outside of the quarantine, you're going to be fine. Fever and burns are actually kind of interesting to me. Fever, of course, is a regulated event to kind of fight off an infection. Fever can really exacerbate the amount of fluid loss that you need to consider to replacing those fluids to stay within homeostasis, because the feeling of being dehydrated can sometimes be just as bad as being sick, in my opinion. And burns, of course, you burn off your skin, you lose the ability to, regulate your fluid loss through your skin. So it's almost like heavy sweating. But I will say, for a fever, a good rule of thumb, I say this in micro too, is for every degree of fever, you lose a 100 milliliter amount of fluid per hour as an adult. So if you have, a 2-degree fever, you need to be replacing 200 mils of fluid per hour to stay within homeostasis. And sometimes that's hard to do. And you get like headaches and like just like that fatigue and just achiness. Sometimes that's actually from dehydration. It's just a good rule of thumb is 100 mils per hour per degree of fever. Anyway, we want to keep this water where it needs to be so that cells are nice and happy. They're not too swollen, they're not crenated or shrunken. If that does happen, if they get too swollen or too shrunken, they can become damaged. So I will say, a lot of people don't realize that too much water ingestion can actually cause a condition called water intoxication. Um, that happens sometimes when people drink distilled or bottled, just plain water faster than they can excrete it. I don't see this very often, but I mean, it does happen sometimes. That's kind of why you want to replace like massive amounts of fluid with something that contains electrolytes just to kind of help balance that sort of stuff. Um, the worst, I think, the worst examples I've seen of water intoxication come from like wrestlers who will sometimes manipulate their water balance to make weight to wrestle at a certain body weight, and it's like they'll forcibly dehydrate themselves and then replace with like just plain water, like gallons of it, and that's not good. Sometimes, with lots of replacement, you want to have some kind of a medically isotonic solution. Also, that's why we hydrate with saline, because it has a little bit of salt in it. It has 0.9% sodium chloride. So, like, that kind of is like the same saltiness as your cells so that you don't get this whole shrinkage and swelling kind of stuff. Anyway, I will also say another thing to worry about with fluid balance is enemas. For those of you who are going into the field of radiography, there are certain types of images that require rad techs and x-ray techs to actually do enemas and stuff. It's kind of interesting. Um, you need to use an isotonic solution, and a lot of times with and I'll pick on paramedics for a second. Um, one of the one of the critical things that can happen when people are over like body temperature, like hyperthermic, is that we will sometimes have to do an emergency ice water enema in the field, and that should be isotonic too. I don't think it always is, but it's just kind of good to know that fluid balance can be from the input into the mouth, or it can be through the output, through the rectum, and you just kind of have to make sure that that stuff stays balanced. Anyway, let's talk about electrolytes. So here is something we can control. So if we can control the movement of solutes, we can actually also control osmosis. So because that like shell of water surrounding charged particles and solutes kind of comes as a unit, this is how we regulate osmosis, is just like it piggybacks by regulating all these electrolytes. And of course, we're going to talk specifically about acid-base balance. We've already talked about electrical currents with sodium and potassium, like how we pump the sodium outside of cells and the potassium is on the inside, and that allows us to kind of like have electrical currents. That's kind of cool. There's also going to be things like magnesium. Those are important integral components of enzymes. So cofactors are just like the key ingredient that make an enzyme work. And a good example is iron is the cofactor of hemoglobin, which allows it for, oxygen binding to work. So a cofactor is just kind of some cool exotic thing. Anyway, you're going to see this expressed in milli equivalents per liter. It's a horrible unit. I get it. It just like you can't say it. It does not roll off the tongue, let's say. But there's three areas where I want you to take a look at the concentration of different electrolytes, and that's going to be the plasma, the interstitial fluid, and the intracellular fluid. And I'm going to tell you one more time, you already know this stuff. You've seen it in other places. I'm just going to present it in a way that might feel a little bit new. But if you just kind of go back and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I've seen this before. It's all there. So first let's look at the plasma. The blood plasma has a lot of proteins. It's got the albumin, it's got all sorts of proteins in there. Um, we don't see those escape the capillary. So proteins should be in the plasma. We should not see them in the interstitial fluid, but we will also see them inside cells because, of course, cells have proteins, right? For the extracellular fluid, we know that the sodium is pumped out as fast as it can leak in, and it loves chloride. Like on a periodic table, sodium is the perfect match for chloride. So because those two things are so attracted to one another, we don't really have to do much about the chloride. We just kind of pump the sodium out and the chloride just kind of hangs out with its bestie. With the intracellular fluid, the cytoplasm of the cell, of course, we're going to have proteins in there. We're going to have the potassium because that's how we like pump the sodium out, is we pump the potassium in. And also phosphates. Remember, phosphates are part of the membrane. They're part of ATP. They're part of the DNA and the RNA. Like the phosphates are definitely going to be locked inside the cell. We shouldn't see them anywhere else. Now here is a really beautiful table with all three of those compartments and the relative concentration of those electrolytes. And this is a really great way to just visualize this information. We know that sodium is in the blood plasma. Remember, because it's the most abundant thing that actually enters the kidney. We just talked about that last week. We know that it's in the interstitial fluid or the extracellular fluid, but there's a very low amount of sodium inside the cells. Now, a little bit does leak in. I mean, a little bit is in there, but relatively, most of that sodium is going to be outside in either the interstitial or the blood plasma compartment. Chloride is just a mirror of sodium, so you don't really have to think about anything there. Bicarb, bicarb is a little bit everywhere. It's definitely in the blood. It's definitely in the interstitial fluid, and we definitely have bicarb inside the cell. So I actually say that one's kind of like a little bit everywhere. Now, potassium is the exact opposite of sodium, right? Is we pump sodium out and pump potassium in, we know that those are going to be like mirror images of each other. Phosphate is really just inside the cell. Remember, that's membranes, genetic material, ATP, that kind of stuff. Calcium, I don't know if it's been a while since you've heard me say this, so I'm going to say it again. Calcium is the most tightly regulated electrolyte in the human body, period. Calcium initiates blood clotting. It initiates muscle contraction. It initiates neurotransmitter release. It is so vital that we don't have loose calcium running around, or all of those things would misfire. Like, just think about that for a second, and you'll realize that we can't have calcium loose anyplace. Magnesium is a cofactor for some cool enzymes inside the cell. It's actually like a cofactor of like the electron transport chain, for example. I think magnesium is interesting because magnesium is highly flammable, right? Like, it's like the head of a match. I just think it's really cool that we even have a use for magnesium, but it's pretty much locked inside of the cells. We don't see it a lot elsewhere. Proteins, like I said, we're going to see those inside the cells and inside the blood, but not in the interstitial fluid. That would just clog up everything and make it hard. Now, the next few slides are just kind of like background information about all of those things, but if you can see like how the distribution of these electrolytes look in these three compartments, you're good to go. So just some cool facts about sodium. Sodium's always number one. We eat way more sodium than we need. In fact, I think sodium is actually really interesting because sodium is a rock, right? I mean, just think about that for a second. It's a crystal that you eat, and it is extremely interesting how physiologically it works with all of these different systems, and it's just interesting. You are hardwired to crave it, I think, for that reason. But if you look at your daily average intake of sodium, it is probably much higher than you need. Like, you really don't need to replace, 1,000 milligrams of sodium a day. Most American diets are very, very high in sodium. Anyway, when we talk about the regulation of sodium, we're talking about aldosterone, ADH, and atrial natriuretic peptide, depending on our situation. I would say the two that are the most common are aldosterone to increase the reabsorption of sodium, and then ADH works on sodium levels. Like, it just sort of depends on your level of dehydration. The ADH is primarily there for water reabsorption, but it can work on sodium levels because dehydration and sodium levels can go together. And when your sodium levels are too low, your ADH is going to turn off, because that usually is because you have too much water on board, which is also why you see the atrial natriuretic peptide start to release the sodium in the water to, relieve the pressure of having too much blood volume. Chloride, this one is a pretty common anion, which again is a negatively charged ion. It just kind of leaks around. Like, I don't know, it's kind of there to balance things. We've seen it in terms of the chloride shift with the production of stomach acid or gastric juice. Just kind of depends on what our situation is. If we're talking about, the blood chloride shift or the GI chloride shift, I would say if you know how sodium is regulated, that's how chloride also is regulated. It's just the body pays more attention to sodium levels, and then the chloride is just like, oh, cool, as a bonus. For potassium, we'll see that this is super vital in the intracellular fluid. Remember the resting membrane potential and all of the muscle stuff that happens with potassium. We will see potassium kind of play a role in pH. There's been some examples where we've seen like a hydrogen ion switch places with a potassium ion. That's kind of what I'm talking about. And then the potassium just gets recycled. We'll see that this is also aldosterone controlled because those principal cells exchange sodium for potassium. It's a super common this for that type exchanger, but potassium levels need to stay very controlled because they can trigger, irregular heart rhythms or other types of muscle contractions. Basically, you really don't want your potassium levels to get too high, basically. So that's kind of where the other aldosterone pathway will kick on regardless of dehydration. You'll excrete excessive potassium so that you don't have that adverse like heart and muscular activity. Bicarb, we've kind of seen this one action. We've seen this in action a lot, actually. It's been like every week that we've seen bicarb. Super common anion. It is a buffer, which means it can take strong acids and bases and make them into weaker ones by kind of buffering some of the intensity. We'll see that bicarbonate levels can really change as you circulate the bicarb in the blood through the pulmonary and the systemic circuits. I think this should kind of sound like a review from the first chapter of this course, but kidneys are definitely going to be the main regulator of plasma levels. So your kidneys are going to be like, okay, I have a lot of bicarb, I can let some go, or it will recover more if the body needs more of that bicarb recovered. For calcium, a lot of your calcium is locked away in bones and teeth, which makes sense. It's a pretty hard crystal, so you want something strong for that stuff. It's pretty abundant. Like I said, it's regulated very tightly. Let me go back on what I just said. The levels of calcium in your body are abundant, but they are locked away for the most part in teeth and bone. You can withdraw them as necessary because you don't want your plasma levels to be high. You don't want your interstitial levels to be high. You don't want your intercellular levels to be high. You do, however, have an abundant resource in that like bank of the skeleton. You don't want to leach it too much or your skeleton will get weak. Anyway, there's not like anything that can happen really that's important without calcium. So that's why we regulate it so carefully. And this should be a good review. Parathyroid hormone is going to be stimulating the reabsorption of bone if your blood levels are too low. That just leaches the calcium from the skeleton, and when the calcium levels get too high, we have the calcitonin, which is going to restore the calcium matrix inside the bone. I guess you could probably pull it from the teeth, but I don't know, probably not worth it, right? Anyway, good review, parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. Phosphate kind of goes along with bone because bone is actually calcium phosphate, but you do need phosphate for other things, genetic material, membrane, ATP, of course. This is another one where it can act as a buffer, and because calcium and phosphate are locked together, the same hormones that regulate the calcium are also going to be regulating the phosphate. But I will say, as just a reminder, high levels of calcium with phosphate can undergo calcification on tissue that's not bone. So where we recover the calcium from the urine filtrate, for example, we will see that parathyroid hormone, while recovering calcium, it allows the phosphate to be excreted. So your levels of phosphate will go down so that you don't run the risk of like calcification of hyaline cartilage, for example, or tendons are another one that can get kind of crispy with age. That's just kind of a failure of the system from working. Anyway, magnesium, kind of cool. Like I said, it's kind of a fancy, exotic center of an enzyme, but you do need it for things. You'll see rarely does this come out of balance, but because magnesium is also part of the bone matrix, it makes sense, right, that this is all going to be regulated together. So let's look at acids and bases for a second. Acids and bases are like hydrogen ions or hydroxide, which is an OH minus. There are different acids and there are different bases out there, but that's kind of the simplest way of describing them. So I will say it is vital that you stay within a range of homeostasis. So remember, pH is a logarithmic scale, which means a very small change in the number is actually a huge difference in terms of the concentration. So your blood acid base level is 7.4 on average. However, it's a normal range that we need to talk about now, and that range can go from 7.35 to 7.45, and that's not a very big range if you think about it. But what happens when it's too acidic or it's too alkaline is the proteins can sort of denature. So like if you've ever cooked with like acid, like ceviche or whatever, like with lime juice or something, you can actually see protein kind of change, like it actually becomes opaque and it unfolds, it like hard boils basically in front of your eyes. That's what can happen inside your body, which is very, very, very dangerous. So We don't just have one buffer system to regulate pH, we have three buffer systems. There are only a few examples of a organ system that has a triple redundancy in terms of regulating itself. So this is actually really significant. We have three buffers. We will see you can modify your respiration rate, which can help you, release carbon dioxide, which we know is related to acid because our favorite reaction with the hydrogen plus, well, I should say carbon dioxide plus water is going to basically dissociate into a hydrogen ion and a bicarb, but it's that hydrogen ion that kind of is key here. The kidney can also excrete different amounts of acid. So let's look at the actions of the buffer systems first. A buffer just de-intensifies the pH. It doesn't necessarily neutralize it to neutral, but it takes basically a strong acid or a strong base and it makes it weaker. Now, your body can deal with weak acids and bases, but it usually cannot deal with strong ones. These can work pretty fast. You've got them in all your fluid compartments, and those buffer systems, the three buffer systems, are the protein buffer system, the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, which we've actually seen many times, and then the phosphate buffer system, which this will be the first time we see that buffer system in action. We saw the buffer system work in the respiratory system, like how hemoglobin can kind of take a little acid from the tissue and it kind of just clings to one of those little amino acid corners of the globin. That's a buffer. Now we're going to see more of a generic buffer system, but that's basically the idea. And the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system is just your favorite reaction, can go back and forth, and then we'll do the phosphate buffer system. So let's start with the protein buffer system. This one is abundant in both the interior of cells and the blood. So remember, that's just where the proteins are, right? So I would say hemoglobin is a good example. We've already seen that. But albumin is actually a better buffer in the blood than hemoglobin. Like, you want your hemoglobin to kind of do what it's supposed to do, which is carry oxygen. But the albumin is just kind of there, right? And it's the most abundant plasma protein. So it's usually albumin that we're talking about. And if you look at the structure of a protein, one end of a protein has an amine group, which is the NH2, right? That's kind of the special thing that makes it a protein. And then there's a carboxyl group, which is a COOH on the other end. Now, that COOH can pop off the terminal hydrogen to donate that if it needs to in an alkaline environment. The NH2 can basically accept a hydrogen, and temporarily it forms NH3+, but it can basically take a strong hydrogen ion out of circulation and just kind of hold it temporarily. That's kind of how this works. I will say hemoglobin is a little bit different in terms of like its CO2, like it has that Bohr effect, right? So it can kind of vary depending on what the oxygen saturation is, but it's still a buffer when it comes down to it. Now, the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system is where that bicarb can basically determine which direction this reaction will go. So, do you remember that bicarbonic acid in the middle of this reaction is kind of unstable? It can go back into CO2, or it can go forward into an acid and a bicarb depending on whether or not it needs to neutralize an acid or a base environment. I will say there's nothing new about what's on this slide. It's just kind of thinking about it now as a directionality of that reaction in terms of what needs to happen to, de-intensify the acidity or the alkalinity of the surrounding area. For the phosphate buffer system, I will say that you usually only see phosphates inside cells. So this is kind of probably the number one buffer system inside cells. We have dihydrogen phosphate that can basically donate a hydrogen if it wants to buffer a strong base, or it can, as monohydrogen phosphate, accept a hydrogen if if there's a lot of acid in the area. If these slides are not visual enough for you, there is a special tutorial on the buffer system so that you can kind of see how these accept or donate hydrogen ions into the different environments. I know for me this kind of makes more sense visually than just with words, but you'll recognize it one way or the other, I promise. For carbon dioxide, that was kind of one of our other mechanisms of regulating pH. Remember, CO2 and acid are related, right? So just breathing is going to play a role in pH homeostasis. And I want to kind of back up for a second. When you inhale atmosphere and it's got, I don't know, 20.9% oxygen, you can't bring on board more oxygen than you can carry. If you're not needing a lot of oxygen, you're just going to exhale oxygen, right? So you never get to store oxygen that way. But it's a little bit different with exhalation. With exhalation, you will always be releasing carbon dioxide in some amount, depending on the rate of your ventilation. So you can actually keep that CO2 in mind with acid, because as you're releasing CO2, you're releasing the potential for acid, right? So exhalation here is the most important. And there's times when you might modify your rate of breathing depending on what your blood pH chemistry is. And remember, pH numbers that are lower are acidic. pH numbers that are above 7 are alkaline. So let's look at this really fast. Faster breathing, more exhalation, more release or removal of CO2, blood pH increases. It becomes more alkaline, right? If you hold your breath and you keep that CO2 on board, your CO2 will produce acidity, therefore your blood pH decreases, okay? A lot of people get the pH confused with like acid concentration, but a blood pH that has a low number, like stomach acid, right, is 2, that's very acidic. That's where the pH decreases. Don't overthink that stuff. Anyway, your blood is monitored all over the place by different detectors to make sure that your respiratory centers are either getting stimulated or inhibited with the right respiratory rate depending on what your blood pH is telling you. Now, the only other thing you can do is release acid in the urine. So you're producing metabolic acid all the time, like it, and you could think about that as lactic acid, I guess, but there's other acids that are produced as just the consequence of being alive. Your only other way to get rid of that acid, if you can't exhale it, is through the urinary system. So I will say that the kidneys are undervalued in their work that they do to excrete that acid, because one of the problems with renal failure is not just accumulation of toxins in the blood, it's the accumulation of acid. And it's usually the acidity that kills you. Like, that's actually organ failure from just the cytotoxicity of all that acid. But we just talked about the kidneys, so you know that they play a role in acid secretion. And you know, they can play around with buffers and stuff, but if you just remember, they play the key role here in monitoring the acidity levels. That's your only other way of getting rid of acid. You either buffer it, you breathe it out as CO2, or your kidneys are going to have to do the work to eliminate it and also fine-tune the levels of buffer that you would have inside your blood. All right, let's just kind of touch base on some acid-base imbalances. There's a few things I want you to actually have memorized. And the first is that level of normal pH for blood. So remember that normal level is 7.35 to 7.45. If it is below 7.35, that is considered acidosis. If it is above 7.45, that is considered alkalosis. Below or above that range, terrible things can happen. So you don't want to just depend on, I don't know, these systems working, because what if they're not working, right? You have to be able to compensate to correct the problem. So if you have a problem with your respiratory system, you will have renal compensation. If you have something wrong with like your organs, like you're just producing too much acid or you're not excreting them through the kidneys or something, you have respiratory compensation. Compensation is just like, oh gosh, well, what do you do if your pH gets out of whack? You're going to have to do something to keep it within homeostasis. And if you don't, acidosis will basically depress your central nervous system to death. Alkalosis will excite your central nervous system to death. Both of these are catastrophically horrible, right? So, one of the things we have to learn how to do is recognize acidosis and alkalosis. We have to determine what the cause is, like what's causing the problem, and then look to check whether or not the body is compensating, because that can kind of cover up a problem. And if there's a problem and a patient is compensating for it, they still have a problem that needs to be fixed. You can't ignore it. And I will say that this is just one of the things that are automatic. Most of our medicines are alkaline. So like they have like sodium bicarbonate as a way of dissolving and getting the time release of a drug. Like if you give someone a drug that contains a pH thing and they're already in some kind of a disturbance, you could exacerbate their problem and they could die, right? So this is actually kind of fun stuff, but it takes a little bit of practice, and this will be the main focus of the lab. So let me just start by saying we have respiratory problems, which will involve either retaining too much CO2, like you can't get gas exchange of the CO2 to cross back out, like maybe it's lungs are full of fluid or scar tissue or I don't know, something like that. Alkalosis would be like you're overventilating, like hyperventilation basically. Usually that's not associated with pathology, but I will say anxiety is real, right? I think a lot of people can sometimes get overexcited and hyperventilate, and then they feel the symptoms of that, and then it creates a little bit of a positive feedback loop of alarm. Anyway, any respiratory problem will be evident by the levels of CO2 in the blood. There are also going to be potentially metabolic disturbances, and I'm using the word metabolic here as a catch-all. So metabolic is not specific. This could be a problem with the liver. This could be a problem with the intestines. This could be a problem with the kidneys. This is basically like a non-specific, something is wrong in the body, but it's not happening in the lungs. That's what I mean by a metabolic disorder. And metabolic disturbances will be evident by abnormal amounts of bicarbonate ions in the lungs, or not the lungs, but the blood. So if you think about it, what was I going to say? Oh, I know. Bicarbonate levels are things we've talked about in every chapter so far. We've seen them in the respiratory system. We've seen them in the GI tract. We've seen them in metabolism. We've seen them in the urinary system. Bicarbonate is coming from all the different organs. So that makes sense that if something is really weird there, it's going to be evident in a weird, either a low or a high bicarbonate. So remember, the CO2 is from a respiratory problem. And then the bicarb is going to be from a not respiratory problem, but some other problem, which will be considered a metabolic problem. Now let's start with respiratory acidosis. Now, remember, CO2 and acid are completely related. So this kind of makes sense to look for high levels of carbon dioxide, and the P just stands for partial pressure. So where your concentration or your partial pressure of CO2 is high, that can be driving respiratory acidosis. This is because you're not able to get it out of the blood. So you're either not breathing fast enough or you have lung damage. That could be like respiratory centers of the medulla oblongata. Remember, we have our inspiratory and expiratory centers pretty low, down by C2. So like a lower neck, not a lower neck, an upper neck injury, a lower skull injury, I should say. You can compensate a little bit for respiratory acidosis by secreting acid, but you can't do that with an unlimited ability. You're going to be able to maybe get rid of a little bit of acid and kind of compensate a little bit, but you kind of need to fix the problem. So one possible treatment would be administration of extra bicarb. That would be like extra buffer so that it could buffer some of that acidity. More commonly, though, we will go in and we will artificially increase the ventilation of a patient just to get more CO2 excreted. So you still want to like figure out what the underlying issue is. Is it pneumonia? Is it emphysema? Whatever. That needs to get fixed. But a short-term solution could be intravenous administration of sodium bicarb. For respiratory alkalosis, this is going to be alkaline above 7.45. That's where our concentration of CO2 is too low, and this comes from hyperventilation. I feel this when I blow up balloons. Like if you ever get that lightheaded feeling, like if you're just like forcefully expiring like really fast and then you're like, whoa, like it actually does feel like something is wrong. That I would say you just stop blowing balloons up for a few minutes and you're fine. But if you were suddenly at high altitude, like if you went up to like, I don't know, Kilimanjaro or Mount Everest or something, which I think is closed now. Everything's closed. And you hadn't like acclimated and given yourself 6 months to get, BPG on board your red blood cells or whatever, you would be experiencing a very low oxygen atmosphere, and the hypoxia would stimulate your rate of ventilation. So you'd be breathing really heavy, but you wouldn't really be getting enough oxygen anyway. That excessive hyperventilation would still unload CO2 with every expiration, and your blood pH would become more alkaline, and you would just have that lightheaded, just gross, dizzy, horrible feel. There's other diseases that can do it. Just sort of depends on your problem, I guess. You still want to get to the underlying problem, but do know that there can be renal compensation that can retain acid. Now, this is another example of something that is not a good option, right? You don't want to just retain acid to counteract your hyperventilation. You want to kind of get normal, right? You want to calm down. You want to I don't know, breathe into a paper bag. Breathing into a paper bag can be a short-term remedy that can increase your CO2 load. You don't want to do it too much because you can pass out or whatever. But certainly, like if you've seen people breathe into a paper bag for like an anxiety thing, it's kind of old school, but like on paper it pencils out. You just have to be careful. You still want to get plenty of oxygen. Anyway, would not recommend injecting acid into a person to balance the pH. I would just, and I do think anxiety is real. But for other issues, you want to get to the bottom of the problem and treat the problem. Now, metabolic acidosis is not going to have a specific cause necessarily, but it will always look like the concentration of bicarbonate ions is too low. So that can come from diarrhea. Maybe your kidneys aren't functioning. You could have an accumulation of dietary acids, which totally can happen. Kidneys sometimes are a culprit if they're, failing basically. You can compensate by hyperventilation, and I think that is interesting to note. A lot of this list can be fairly indicative of like organ failure, especially kidney failure. People who work in hospice have this uncanny ability to recognize the very end. And a lot of times it comes from hyperventilation in compensation of the metabolic acidosis. Like as you're just not getting the acids like taken away from the dying tissue, it accumulates and you get like this last burst of compensation. I mean, we'll talk about death in a little bit, but you should know that breathing rate can be a real sign of nonverbal communication of things that are happening, and this is one that can actually be very evident. The treatment, we can certainly add some buffers. Best to fix the problem if that's possible. Diarrhea and things like that, we can usually fix that pretty easily. But you want to figure out what the issue is and then hopefully get rid of the problem rather than try to just administer drugs. Metabolic alkalosis is where bicarb levels are too high. Now, that can come from loss of acid through vomiting, excessive diuretics, dehydration can do it. I've seen people take a lot of alkaline drugs like Tums for calcium, like, oh, this is healthy for you, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, that's dangerous if you absorb too much bicarb from diet. And like I said, a lot of our pills have bicarb just to time lapse the release. The respiratory compensation here is to stop breathing, which I never recommend. I mean, certainly you can slow it down, but yeah, that's not good. You still need oxygen, right? Treatment, usually find the source of the problem and get rid of it, like stop the vomiting, change the pills, like that kind of stuff. If it's dehydration, that's usually a pretty easy fix with fluid and electrolytes. But you do feel really sick, like when you're really dehydrated and you feel like really, really sick. Um, it can be hard to recognize at an extreme, I guess. Anyway, there's some tricks for diagnosing acid-base imbalances. I will say whatever works for you. You don't have to go in this order. I always do it in this order. I look at pH, and then I look at bicarb and CO2 kind of at the same time. And then I always ask myself, well, what is the cause? Is it a CO2 that's abnormal? You know that it's a respiratory cause. If it's a bicarb level, it is a metabolic disturbance. And then the trick with the compensation is you have to figure out what is consistent with the cause of the acid base imbalance, and is the body going in the other direction to try to cancel it out. And that's kind of what we're going to practice in the lab stuff. I'll just mention that babies have a really hard time with fluid electrolyte acid base. They have a very high metabolic rate, basically. So they're producing more waste, they need more input, they need more output. They are not sensitive in producing ADH. They're not sensitive to or producing ADH until they're about age 1. So they produce a high volume of only dilute urine, which means they're at risk for dehydration, basically. They also have really big heads, which makes them adorable. But they can lose a little bit of surface water through evaporative cooling a little faster than adults. Anyway, they're just more delicate in all the different ways. Elderly people are also at risk because they usually reduce their fluid intake. They have drugs they might be taking, they have loss of muscle tone. There's just all sorts of reasons they might have imbalance, and particularly the potassium levels. And just as things start to slow down, it can be harder to encourage those patients to basically monitor themselves so that they're producing the right amount of urine and they're still getting good, circulation of acids so that those can get excreted, etc. This was a little bit longer than I planned, but the lab video will kind of do some clarifications, and I'm going to load a special tutorial on how to visualize the 3 chemical buffer systems.